to be here. I'm sure that you all felt the same way the last 2 weeks. I thought, we can't have this every Saturday, this snow. And yesterday, when it was doing it a little bit, I thought, oh no, here we go again. We were in Greenfield last night. Diane's, where she worked for Hancock OB, they were doing their holiday thing. They didn't do things before Christmas, and so it was that last night. And so as we were having the meal, looking out, the snow coming down, every now and then people would get up and look out and say, it's not sticking on the roads yet. So that was good. I'm sure that you all were happy to see each other. Not every church would I say that about. But the thought crossed my mind this morning. I thought, I bet when those people were getting there from Moscow this morning, there was lots of hugging going on. Because I've been impressed by how you at least appear to really like each other. And that should not be something unusual. That should be how it is in the Lord's church, right? The Sunday before last, Center had the services. Didn't have a whole big group. I think there was 40-something at the first service and 102 or something at the second one. And then last Sunday, I knew you guys weren't having services here. Center didn't have services. I checked Wilkinson. I checked Knightstown. I thought they're just a mile away, and they're right there in town. Surely they know. They couldn't either. So anyway, we drove to Greenfield Park Chapel. We're just not far off of 40, and it was a good road to go on. And so that was interesting to be there and to share with them. I don't know if because I started this stewardship series that this is what caused all this, because preachers, talking about money. But sometimes people think that's the only thing that is involved in stewardship, but you know that that's not the case. But anyway, we're going to continue, and so there will be a couple more messages along this line. I planned it just for January, but you get a bonus. We get to go into February as well. 2 Corinthians chapter 9. I'll go ahead and read these verses. We'll refer back to them as we go through the message this morning. 2 Corinthians 9, and we'll read verse 6, then 8, and then 10 through 11. 9:6 says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Verse 8, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. 10 through 11. Now he supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be made rich in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. When we think about stewardship, when we think about giving and involving ourselves in serving Christ, the bottom line that the Bible, I believe, teaches us is if you are generous with your money, and other things as well, but in particular with your money to God's work, then you will be rewarded far more than you ever gave up. Now, I told a story way back in the first Sunday of January that illustrated a little bit of that for Diane and I don't know if you remember. I'm sure you do, because most of you remember everything I say. But anyway, we lived in Williamsburg, Kentucky, First Ministry, and that was when the guy came to the office and wanted to get married, and he wanted to know, first of all, where the preacher was, because I was 22 years old and in my sweatshirt, and he thought I was a part-time janitor or something. And I told him I was the preacher, and he said, no, go get your dad. And I said, no, I'm the preacher. So anyway, as I told you, I did the wedding. Our neighbor, who was in the beginning of Alzheimer's, came and was one of the witnesses. I guess that still counted. And we had no dress up or anything. They wanted to get married because they were on their way to Florida, and they had a Kentucky license, thought they'd get married in Tennessee, couldn't do it, had to come back to Kentucky. But Diane reminded me going home that day, I left the main part of the story out. And I thought, I couldn't believe I did that, because I've told that story. You know how preachers are, we repeat things. Sometimes we don't remember that we do, but we do. But the thing that was different earlier that morning when I was in the office, typing the bulletin, yeah, I actually typed the church bulletin. I'm glad I don't have to do that here. I always let Eva do that. But anyway, I was working on that. That was always a frustrating thing. But this guy came in the building. The doors are open, And when I saw him, I made an assumption. My assumption was right. He was, I think, on his way to Florida. I don't know, everybody's all on their ways to Florida. I don't understand that. But he needed money. And he gave me a sob story and that. And back then, I usually, I hadn't developed a system, I guess you'd say, a way to handle those things. And so I said, okay, I think I had $5 cash in my billfold. And I took that and I gave it to him. And that was when our bank balance in the checkbook was under $5, if I was correct. And we got paid once a month. And it wasn't close to payday yet. It was a little bit away. And I went home and I told Diane what happened that morning. And I gave him the $5 or $10. I don't remember exactly what it was. She said, "You did what?" And I said, "Yes, I did." Well, after that, I went back over, and that's when Elmer and Edna came along, wanted to get married. And after the wedding, they gave me $50 to do the wedding. That's when Diane said, "Go out to the interstate with a sign, see if anybody else is on their way to Florida, because if we can get 5 or 10 and get 50 in a matter of an hour, we're going to be doing pretty good." Okay? I don't think that's the real thought you always want to have in mind. But even though I know that God does reward us, the Bible teaches that, we've experienced it, I sometimes don't think that that should be our primary motive in being generous, that we're going to get rewarded for that. So let's focus on our stewardship of all that God has provided, and that's not just our money. As we consider that, our generosity of all that God has given, we can see how God provides rewards in many different ways. The overall reason for our generosity is because we love God. Okay, that's it. And nothing should compete against that. God wants our heart. He wants our heart to be foremost in loving Him and loving His work. And we won't let anybody that knows us or talks to us is going to sense that and see that very quickly. But at the same time, though, He provides incentives that He doesn't want us to ignore. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So this morning, let's take some time to look at some of these features in this idea of being rewarded for being faithful in this area of stewardship. One guy, when he was in youth, McDonald's gave 1 hamburger for every A on the report card. Anybody remember that? That happened a few times. I see somebody got their attention real quick there. And the parents wanted their kid to get an A to learn and be successful. What did the kid want to get the A for? Have more hamburgers, because at certain ages you're just a sort of a bottomless pit, and you need more and more food. We learned that when our 14-year-old was and his brothers were home for Christmas, and our 14-year-old is now 6'2.5" and 220, and we thought we had a pretty good supply of food on hand. Almost a loaf of bread at one time, when he's doing the sandwiches, and let alone, and his mom finally told him, said, "Logan, do not take the helpings out first. Let other people have something first." Because Diane had a huge bowl of mashed potatoes, and about half of the bowl, I think it was, at least over half. Well, not over half. That would be a little excessive. Anyway, the motivation here, that the kid wanted the hamburger, the parents maybe wanted something else. But parents do things. We reward our kids sometimes. We give them an allowance if they do a good job with the chores that they have around the house. Another guy once I read about was going to the bank, and as he was at the bank, there was a homeless woman that, before he got out of his car, that knocked on his window and asked if he had any change. And he gave her his last dollar, and he went on into the bank, and he got cash. And when he got back to the car, he saw there was $100 more than what he should have got back. The immediate thought he had was, God has rewarded me for being generous. But then he started thinking about the lady in the bank that wouldn't feel the same way, the teller, and he went back in, and yes, she was $100 short, and he gave her the money. And he, a couple of months later, he saw that same woman, and he thought, well, God's not going to give me anything if I give her $1 again. But he got over that thought. He gave her $1 to help. That's a trap that God doesn't want us to get in when we consider His rewards, but at the same time, He doesn't want us to ignore His rewards either. Now, we can talk about the pie in the sky by and by kind of concept, but we are blessed to know that when we leave this life, we're going to have that eternal home in heaven. We're also blessed to know that while we're here, God is going to meet our needs. He says that. Philippians, God will supply all my needs. That's what Paul said. We need to not only say that, but we need to express that and say and show our belief in that by how we deal with situations that come along. Paul again is appealing here in this Corinthian letter for help with the famine that has stricken the Christians in Jerusalem. That's the reason he wrote to the Corinthian church. So let's look at 3 points here about this process of reward that we can see as we look at these scriptures. The first idea here that I want to remind you of is that He follows our lead. He follows our lead. In verse 6 it says, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. God watches your choice and my choice on generosity. If we sow sparingly, we reap sparingly. If we sow generously, we reap generously. I think there are a few people here that are familiar with the farming culture, I would say. And you know that the farmers choose how much seed they're going to plant. The results are going to depend on the choice that's made. If you plant a lot of seed, you hopefully will get a lot of crop. If you don't plant much seed, you're not going to get much crop, are you? Paul uses that metaphor to show how God rewards the generosity of each of us. He waits to see the level of how we're being generous before He decides the level of reward. I know a church several years ago that was making progress, and I don't know where they're at today, but at that time they got to the point where 50% of everything that came in went to missions. 50%. I also met a couple through the years that they had continued to give and increase their giving. And the more that you give, the more God is going to give. And as one person said, they kept giving out and God kept giving back in, and God had a bigger shovel than they had, so they kept getting more. But this couple was continuing to give, and they were living on like 25% and giving away 75%. Now, I know automatically some of you are saying this church is not going to do that. And I can't do that either because I've got bills to pay. And, you know, it's different in every situation, but who knows what you might could do. If we believe that God is God and that God will bless people who are faithful in this very important area of stewardship, who's to say what could happen if we put Him to the test? And prove me, as He says in Malachi. We act first, then God rewards. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 talks about that the barns aren't overflowing until you honor the Lord with your wealth. In Proverbs 11:24, there's a note there that the result of giving away is gaining more. A result of withholding is poverty. Proverbs 22, first part of verse 9, a personal blessing results of that generosity. The principle is God watches our choice. If it's favorable, then the reward of His blessing is given. If it's unfavorable, then I think that reward is withheld. God means what He says, doesn't He? There are many people you encounter today, and you know when they tell you something, you don't have to pay that much attention to it because they don't really mean it. Or what they say is not reliable. But when it comes to God's people, and especially when we as God's people think of God, we know without any equivocation God means what He says. I like this example. This couple was having children. They were dedicated to God, and they had put Him first in generosity, and they had always been faithful in giving that amount to Him each and every week. And when their first child came along, for some reason, their maternity coverage was not in effect. And so they thought, well, we're going to have a pretty good bill to pay. So let's just take away from our tithe to pay that. And they said, no, we can't do that. God, I don't think God would want us to do that. And so they didn't. And they still were wondering. The mom wound up with blood pressure issues that resulted in the insurance kicking in that paid the bill. And their church provided the rest. Second child came along. They still didn't have maternity coverage. You'd think maybe they thought a little bit about that. But they still would not take from the tithe to pay. The husband said he prayed. He said, okay. After the child was born, he said, okay, God, do your blood pressure thing again. And he did. The wife had blood pressure problems again. Maybe for other reasons, I don't know. But it kicked in, paid part of it, and the church again paid the rest. I wonder what the chairman of the board of that church was thinking. Third child came along. They were in the process of moving. This time, no maternity. The baby had complications, the insurance paid, and their new church family, where they moved, took care of it. Now that might be a little extreme example, but when we put him first, he will provide our needs. God means what he says. If we sow generously, we'll reap generously. So we do what God asks us to do in his word, and then we sit back and watch and see what he does. I'm sure there are things that this church has done in this area of Rush County that some people would have said, you couldn't do that. And I don't know. I've not been in very many. I've been in a few meetings with your elders, but I've not been in any board meeting or lots of meetings where someone would bring up something and automatically someone would say, no, we can't do that. I have been in meetings like that where we tend to limit God. But I think we need to have that vision in this year of 2019. Isn't it awful to say 20? I still want to say 19 something, you know. But, it's 2019. 2020 is coming. That's a TV show. When you think of what's coming, there's a way to let God do what God wants to do. The amazing. Second point, he meets our need. That's why we can see this. Verse 8 tells us that. Verse 8 says, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that in all things at all times, having all you need, you'll abound in every good work. God's power is seen when we're generous. Teacher quizzed her student. She said, Joe, you have $2, and you tell your dad you need $4 more. Now, how many dollars are you going to have? And Joe said, $2. And she said, Joe, you don't know math. And Joe says, teacher, you don't know my dad. That's different from what Paul says about God. God's nature is to reward generosity. This text notices two things. First of all, we'll have all that you need. Now, there are some times that people think they need things that they really don't need. What do you actually need? In this weather here in Indiana, you do need shelter. I just thought, and of course this week it's going to get really cold again, and we know that there are people that don't have any place to stay, and sometimes they're out on the street under a bridge or something like that. I know Wheeler Mission has opened last week, and we're putting cots down everywhere, and I think their capacity is like 200 and something. We're going to have like 450 there in the building. I saw another shelter, I think it was for women, in one of the churches in Indy, a building there I think they're not using. And anyway, they were getting it ready for that. You know, you need shelter. You need food. Some of you are saying, I need it right now. Okay. Do we need all that we have? No. Nice and warm at night, and you're trying to, you're relaxing after a good day and stuff, and maybe your favorite game show, whatever is on TV, and you make the mistake of going to the kitchen, and you like potato chips, and you get the bag of potato chips. You bring the bag with you back to sit in your comfortable chair, and what do? Before you know it, there are no potato chips in that bag. Did you need a whole bag of potato chips? Now, my grandson would probably say, yes, I do. Okay. By the way, the 14-year-old I talked about, he was the one that had a concussion in playing his first football game as a freshman on the varsity team, missed the rest of the year, got cleared for that. He went back into wrestling, and yesterday in a wrestling match, they think maybe he's got another concussion. So I appreciate your prayers. I don't think he's going to be playing any more sports the rest of this year. But that means he's going to be eating a lot more, probably. Okay. Do we need all those things? No. But God will meet our needs. And then God is able. The word that we get dynamite from is sort of here. God has that kind of power. He is not a weak God. He is not an insufficient God. That power can be unleashed. And when we're generous and choose to be generous, we're messing with dynamite. I remember first couple of years we were at Center, we had a Thanksgiving offering. They always have a Thanksgiving offering. And one of the things the Thanksgiving offering used to be was to catch up on all the bills that hadn't been paid. And so we had discussions in the missions team and others, and we said, okay, this year, let's do something different. Let's give all the money to missions this year. And we had a young lady from the church that had gone to Johnson. She and her husband were in Africa, and they were trying to get back to Zambia. And so that's what they decided to do. And I think our Thanksgiving offering, which normally at that time was maybe $3,000 or $4,000, it was almost $17,000 to help that family get back to the mission field. And that continued to be in the last 10 years. Center Church has given over $1 million to missions. It's not that huge. How can that be? Because people want to do what God wants them to do. And we don't need to look at certain levels. We see how God blesses us, and we in turn say, do that within us. Follow Paul's advice here. Sometimes it's a tough hurdle in the process to become generous. The human mind says, if I give my money away, then I won't be able to take care of my needs. Some people, if you talk to at the workplace tomorrow, or maybe you talk to some of your family, or maybe you have a conversation with someone today as you go home and say, we can't do that. I need that. The high school student says, I got to get gas in the car. I got to go to the movie. The single mom says, I need money to take care of my kids. A young family needs money to pay their mortgage. The retiree doesn't want that nest egg to disappear. And those are all valid concerns. But Paul says to allow God to worry about those things. Now, I'm not talking about being irresponsible at all, but let God worry about those things and transfer that to Him to be generous. As you work, and as you do, He will supply the need. A couple early in their marriage were talking about the retirement fund. They were told to take from the tithe to put money in it, and if they would do that, they wouldn't have anything left in the fund. They were told to try it God's way and to be generous, and then God would kick in His blessing to meet the needs. And He did. And He did. We understand the goal that's involved here. Sharing from the heart about what God has given us. We're not talking to try to have super special fancy building. We don't need to be excessive. That's not the reason for having that. We need to be interested in experiencing God's power in our life. And I think I can attest with certainty that power is unleashed through generosity. God always meets your needs. Always. Third point. There's only usually 3, If you look at the outline, it says 3, but you never know. Well, I could add it in. But no, we'll just do 3. He increases our capacity to be generous. That's what verses 10 and 11 says. Now He supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, will also supply and increase your store of seed, and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. You will be made rich in every way, so that you can be generous on every occasion, and through us your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. Following the cycle. Following that cycle. All of this from God is good news. Why does God do this? He does it because He's loving and graceful and He's true. Paul wants us to understand, verse 11, that God rewards us so that we can keep on being generous and continue that cycle. We're generous to the work of God. He rewards with generosity so that we in turn can continue to be generous. Your generosity keeps that cycle moving. If you stop being generous, that cycle is broken. Do you want to live within a sphere of God's dynamic power, where things really are clearly seen that God has a hand in whatever is happening? Do you want God meeting your needs instead of you having to worry about them? My grandmother, my mom's side, Granny Cox as I called her, she was about 4 foot tall. Used to be closer to about 4 foot wide, but anyway, had a rough life. She had 11 children. Only 3 lived to be adults. All the others died at birth. The one that almost made it beyond the younger years died with another issue. But she was a person that knew God's power and kept that power in life. God wants you to keep on being generous to the work of God. Your generosity keeps that moving. Do you want the joy of being able to help the work of God like others do? That cycle starts when you choose to be generous. When they sold their store, my grandmother, at the end, my grandfather didn't live very long after that, only 6 months after they built a new house, and my grandma went to the lawyer to clear everything up, and he said, "Miss Cox, you've got there's thousands of dollars here that people owe you. We need to get that money." She said, "No, we don't. They know they owe it. And if they want to pay it, they'll pay it. I'm not going to do that." She could have used the money. She wasn't a wealthy lady. But she said, "God will take care of me." My mom and her sisters used to tell her, "Granny, you don't need to be living there by yourself." And she would say, "Well, if anybody comes in, they'll let me loose in the morning." "Yeah, Granny, but that morning might not come too quick, you know." She said, "God's going to take care of me." Having that correct motivation. What happens when you pay your taxes? Going to be doing that before long. Do you clap your hands? Do cartwheels? Are you just thrilled with that opportunity to do that? One guy said it didn't bother him at all paying his taxes. Most people have a lot of comments about that. Why? He said, well, he liked to have paved roads. He liked to have schools for his kids. He liked to have police and fire personnel. He liked to have warnings when storms came. He said he taught his kids about the political process, about explaining how we got our freedoms and how this thing works. And he says if the tax check keeps that cycle of blessings coming, I'll keep writing that check with pleasure. I guess we still can be concerned about what they're doing with the money, okay. But if you feel that way here in Rush County, Indiana, in the United States of America, then how much more? So you can see what God can do in changing things for His good. I've used this story many times. It is supposed to be true, okay? I don't have any reason to doubt it. But they told us about a small town church in Kansas. The treasurer resigned. Being a church treasurer is not an easy job. I think from all appearances, Vernon does an excellent job. We were blessed at Center for many years to have Ray Hay as our treasurer. I think I've used this before. Our standing joke with Ray, I would go in some morning, he'd be signing checks and doing things. I'd say, "Ray, I need a check for $10,000. He'd say, "If they approve it, I'll write it." But he was faithful, being a treasurer. And so this church treasurer resigned. The operator of the local grain elevator, who did business with most of the farmers in the community, was asked to take the job. He agreed on 2 conditions. You elders, see if you like this. The two conditions: no treasurer's report would be given the first year. I don't think Vern, he's writing this down. The other condition: no questions be asked about the budget. Okay. They agreed, since he was a man to be trusted. At the end of the year, he gave his report. You're having your annual meeting. Maybe Vernon will give this report. I don't know. At the end of the year, he gave the church indebtedness of $240,000 had been totally paid off. Okay. Staff salaries had been increased. Missions had been paid 200%. No bills were outstanding, and there was $10,000 balance in the checking account. The shocked congregation, that's putting it mildly, isn't it? Well, they probably had to revive people as they fell on the floor here. How did you do it? He said, most of you bring your grain to my elevator. I simply withheld 10% of your grain on behalf of the church. You never missed it. Do you see what God could do if you were willing to give that 10? Now, I don't know about your giving. I've seen some totals that are very impressive about how you give. But individually, I don't know where you're at in that. Tithing is an Old Testament teaching. We're reminded in Scripture that our righteousness should exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. They would not be caught dead not giving 10%. How they used it and how they took care of it maybe needs some improvement there. But if you're not giving at that level, start somewhere. Try 1%. Try 2%. God says, if you trust Him, don't be surprised that the windows of heaven will not be open and pour out a blessing. There'll be not room enough to contain it. And that doesn't mean what Diane and I there in Williamsburg, Kentucky years ago gave that guy $5, $10 and got 50 real quick. No, it might not be anyway financially. My grandmother survived on a very little amount of money, but she was rich in more ways than most people knew. What about you? Are you sowing sparingly? Or are you sowing generously? How did God treat you? How did Jesus give to you? Did He just give a little of Himself? He went to the cross, didn't He? Died on the cross. Total sacrifice. He did that. What He asked of us seems awful little in comparison, doesn't it? But it begins with you giving yourself to Him. That's the response that you need to make if you haven't. You need to give yourself to Him.